Good morning, everyone. Let's begin. My name is Emery Edwards, a member of the Board of Trustees for the New Jersey Business and Immigration Coalition. I am part of the Hudson County Chamber of Commerce, where I'm the president and CEO, and we're also a member organization of the coalition. It is a privilege to welcome all of you today to our vital policy discussion. The coalition is dedicated to the pursuit of sensible, evidence-based, and bipartisan immigration policy. Our work takes on greater importance in the current environment when misinformation on immigration matters is rampant and when current policymaking decisions might hinder both present and future economic growth. For example, in Hudson County, 42.5% of our population was born outside of the US, which surpasses the 24.2% of New Jersey's foreign-born population, which itself is only second to California and significantly passes the national average of 13.6%. Therefore, immigration policy decisions will land harder in my home county and in New Jersey. However, many of the new immigration policy questions we're examining, especially today, are considered more existential by many. The decline of the world's population may be reaching a critical point, with the first projected dip in over 700 years. What is our demographic future? A declining population may be bad for the economy, but longer term, it may be good for the planet. How does population decline impact American immigration policy? Are there steps that can or should be taken to reverse this population trend? Will the world's percentage of migrants also shrink below the current 3.7%? With birth rates in the US also declining, immigration has been a stabilizing factor to maintain and strengthen our own workforce. How will this change? And also, how do we respond to increasing competition among advanced economies for immigrants in a wide range of occupational categories? Luckily, we have three esteemed speakers with us to help us better understand and answer these challenges. Each of them will begin with an opening remark and then form a panel to interact and respond to any questions that you might have. If you have a question, please go ahead and type them in the chat as soon as they come into your mind. It's so easy to forget a question as the program continues. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Our first distinguished speaker today is Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt. Nick holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he writes extensively on demographics, economic development, and international security. As an AEI scholar, he is committed to making the intellectual and practical case for expanding freedom and strengthening the free enterprise system in America and around the world. Nick is the author of an important study published last December entitled World Depopulation, Prospects and Implications, which we'll hear about today. He has also published many other books over the course of a long career. Nick earned his undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degrees from Harvard University, and also received a Master of Science degree from the London School of Economics. Thank you, Dr. Eberstadt, for giving us the benefit of your research and insights. Our next speaker will be Leah Labresco-Sargent, Senior Policy Analysis at the Niskanen Center, whose main area of research interest is family economic security. Described by Time magazine as the most interesting think tank in American politics, the Niskanen Center prides itself on drawing ideas from across the political spectrum and advocating for policies that overcome the current intense partisanship in American politics. Leah has done research on efforts undertaken by governments around the world and in the United States to increase birth rates, so we'll gain insight into her perspective on this larger issue. Welcome. We greatly appreciate your joining us today. And finally, we also welcome Jack Malday, Associate Director of the Human Capital Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The center's work in the area of immigration provides an appealing pathway forward for future immigration policy. His main concern is that the U.S. should have enough workers with the right skills and supports to to thrive and promote global competitiveness. Prior to joining the Bipartisan Policy Center, Jack served as senior economist at the Confederation of British Industry. He currently serves as co-host of a weekly immigration podcast run by the Bipartisan Policy Center. Jack, it's great to have you with us today as well. Just so you know, each of our panel speakers will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each before joining again as a panel. Thank you again, Dr. Eberstadt, for joining us today. I will turn the floor over to you.
Emery, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation. Let's get this, see if this is the screen share function working properly. A Wizard of Oz?
Yes.
Is that okay? There we are. All of us in this gathering are children of the global population explosion. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we tend to think of world population as invariably, inexorably increasing. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is show why it might be good to have a new expectation for the world that we're entering, because trends have been really surprising over the past couple of decades and over the last decade in particular. I don't expect everybody to memorize the numbers on this chart, but you just take a look at one or two of these to tell you that, we're not in your father's population explosion territory anymore. You need about 2.1 births per woman per lifetime for long-term population stability in the absence of compensating immigration. And not just in rich countries, but in a lot of low income or emerging economies, the reality now is that very substantially below replacement fertility is already in effect. In Asia, in Latin America, even in countries that are off the African coast, we're seeing fertility patterns that are 30 or more percent below replacement. Calcutta, which I first visited as a young man, now has one birth per woman per lifetime in India. Mexico, for the first time since we've started collecting these statistics, has a lower birth level than the United States, and Mexico City has less than one birth per woman per lifetime. We could go on, but I just want to make the point we're in a very new environment. If we look at fertility levels by continent, we can see that at this point, the only continent that has an above replacement fertility pattern is Africa. Europe, North America, Australia, Latin America, Asia are all already below replacement. And you know what happens if you keep on with below replacement fertility. In fact, if we look at the global numbers, and there's some uncertainty about this because there are some countries that don't collect and release up-to-date, accurate birth and death trends. There's weak statistical systems more likely to be in sub-Saharan region, for example. But to some degree, we have to look in the rear view mirror to get a really accurate assessment at any point in time. Given what we know right now, it's not impossible that the planet as a whole has already gone below the replacement fertility threshold. We may already be living in a sub-replacement world. If we're not, stick around for a year or two. This is coming at us much faster than experts anticipated even a few years ago. And the reasons for this are something we can discuss, but right now I'm just talking about trends and consequences. One of the consequences is inescapably massive graying of societies. You have fewer people coming into the base of the population pyramid, pinches the pyramid, a larger proportion are gray. And you can see here that we are entering a world that we've never encountered before, uh, with a grayer population profile than we've ever yet experienced all over the world, all over the world. It also means that most countries in the world, uh, on their own domestic trends, are going to see shrinking youth labor forces in the very near future. The only way to circumvent these downward pressures, of course, is through immigration. This is just one of many population pyramids I could show you to give you a sense of what the new order is going to look like. It's for China, the second most populous country, um, very important economy. Um, I've superimposed the 2050 population pyramid on top of the 2020 just to give you a sense of how dramatic the shrinkage of working age population over the next generation is on track to be for a major country, and how enormous the explosion of older people, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, stands to be. This is going to change naturally, not just society, but also economic performance, maybe even politics. The United States is still a kind of an exception to the big generalizations I was showing you, in part because our birth levels are less below replacement than many other rich countries, in part because of our immigration flows up until now. The outlook is for modest growth in overall population, modest growth in working age population, more moderate population aging than for any of the other affluent areas in the world. But a lot of this depends upon assumptions about immigration. Um, you can see in this chart, comparing East Asia to the USA, that migration plays a very small role in East Asia, which is why the East Asian area has already tilted into depopulation. It's been depopulating for 4 or 5 years now. That gray line at the bottom, migration, is what keeps United States population growing in these projections in the future for longer than other areas in a world that may be depopulating. And just to emphasize how important um, immigration is to the head count in the United States for working age population. U.S. Census Bureau came out with some projections in 2023 for the future with zero immigration, low immigration, medium immigration, high immigration, by their own assessments of what those different scenarios meant. If you look at the zero immigration scenario, guess what? The American working age population would be shrinking right now as we're talking. Without immigration in the United States, given our own population structure, our working age population would already be shrinking. And on these same Census Bureau projections, deaths would exceed births in the United States in less than 10 years, which is to say, in less than 10 years, absent immigration, the United States population as a whole would begin to decline, as Europe's population is declining now, as East Asia's population is declining now. So these trends bring, I think, a special importance to thinking about immigration and its role in social renewal and an economic performance for our country and for others. One last thing to show you. Um, Immigrants have played a remarkable role in the United States in particular in innovation, invention, and entrepreneurship. It may be a small portion of the overall immigration flows into the United States, but the results are unlike anything we see in any other country. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much for giving us the global context for today's discussion. It's really fascinating. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Leah, who will assess current efforts to improve birth rates. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for Nick giving us that global portrait. I'm going to zoom in on America and American family policy. So to start with, when we're talking about population decline, I really want to highlight two distinct kinds of gaps that we're seeing in America. The first is what Nick was talking about, the gap between our actual fertility levels and replacement rate fertility levels. So this is what drives the problem of just a graying society, less dynamism, fewer workers, et cetera. It's a problem in and of itself. And we're already slipping below replacement rate here. The time to think about what our actions are going to be is now, not when we're down in the levels of some of those more extreme countries that Nick highlighted, when a lot of the disruption will be much more substantially baked in. The disruption is already coming, but now's the time to stop the bleeding. But then I want to highlight a different fertility gap that's really specific to America that we can speak to, which is the fertility gap between the number of children Americans say they want to have and the number they actually have. And I want to highlight this both because it should give us a little more hope about the replacement rate gap, and because I think it's worthy of being talked about as a problem in and of itself. Even if we were at the replacement rate level, we had no broader macroeconomic concerns, this fertility gap between desired and intended fertility would still be a problem. So in America, that fertility gap is about one child per woman. That doesn't mean every woman you know wants to have one more child than she has, but it means that that gap on average means that women are achieving one fewer baby than they would like to have. And so what does that mean? Well, let's look at the problems that come out of both these gaps. First of all, it means that hopefully we can ameliorate that replacement level gap by simply helping people have the children they want to have. It means we're not trying to coerce people. We're not twisting the arms of the childless. For anyone on this call whose mother is personally haranguing you to have more children, that's not the policy goal. We're looking for not a million mom march of aspiring grandmothers. We're trying to respond to a real desire that's out there and ask what are the blockers that are keeping people from having the children they already intend to have and want to have. Now, these two gaps, the replacement gap and the desire gap, both cause problems. As Nick has highlighted really well, that gap between us and the replacement level mutes American dynamism. When you have fewer young people, you lose out on some of the things that make America such a prosperous nation. You lose out on people who are young and taking risks, who have less to lose, who don't have families yet, who start businesses, fail, but maybe 1 out of every 10 takes off in a big way. You get a slowing down of the economy, of innovation, and you lose out on kind of that kinetic power that keeps America ahead of the rest of the world. You also see the erosion of a lot of the supports of our social welfare policies. Social Security depends on there being new workers. So you start to have a hollowing out of things we've built that depend on there being young people. Now, what are the parallel problems that are distinct to that desire versus achieved fertility gap? I think some of them are similar. It's a lack of dynamism, a lack of hope. Why do people not have the children they want to have? Part of it's concern about what the future will look like, whether they're ready to support children into that future, whether you can have the next child you want without shortchanging the toddler you already have. And so I think America should see that as a problem in and of itself, regardless of that kind of bigger Social Security macroeconomic policy problem, because the most basic function of the state is to be there as a safeguard for the institutions that precede the state. The family as a natural institution precedes the state and exists to be supported and protected by the state. When families aren't succeeding at having the children they want and long to have, the state is failing at a very basic level in the same way it would fail if it can't maintain its territorial integrity against invaders. It's one of the basic core functions of a state to assist families in flourishing. And so, what does that range of solutions look like? In the short term, immigration is without question part of the solution to what does our population look like? How are we bolstering parts of the economy that we're not currently prepared to support? But it's not a complete answer because, part of the way I think about this is that when you're very old, when you're approaching the end of your life, immigration policy can solve the problem of there being an employment gap in the number of nurses needed to support the elderly. A nurse can come to America and help take care of you. But immigration cannot solve the problem of who is visiting you in the hospital, holding your hand, and talking to you as someone who's loved you your whole life. Immigration can fill a nursing gap, but it can't fill a grandchild gap or even a grandniece gap in that way. So we really want to work the problem from both ends. I'm going to leave it to some of my fellow panelists to talk a little more about some of those immigration solutions and trade-offs. I'm just going to touch it at a high level because my specialty is family policy. But I think we can think about immigration as having kind of two streams. We have high value workers, whether because they're coming in at a very high level and starting businesses, or they're coming in to plug a necessary gap in our workforce. They're both high value to America, where accelerating, encouraging, supporting those immigrants serves American interests. I think you can think of another stream, and they overlap a little bit, of extremely vulnerable people from around the world whom America serves as a beacon of hope and as a last reliable refuge. That for many reasons, folks who face religious persecution abroad, folks who face political oppression know that America is a place where they can practice their faith safely, raise children well, and where they don't need to worry that their authoritarian government will kidnap them off the street with no consequences they might in other places they find refuge. So American immigration both looks for the people who serve America and the people America can uniquely serve as a beacon of hope. But now let's turn to family policy. When we're trying to close that replacement level gap, when we're trying to help close that desire versus achieve fertility gap, how can we help parents have the children they want? Again, I think this is substantially about reducing barriers to parenthood rather than coercing anyone who is happily childless into having children they do not desire. And I think a lot of this involves looking at where we can support parents at the time when money and family benefits go the furthest. I put a big emphasis on the child tax credit, which is kind of a matter of basic fairness to families. The child tax credit exists to make sure that a family, let's say with $80,000 in income, $60,000 in income, and one kid, two kids, is treated fairly in terms of how much of their income is available to be taxed relative to a childless couple with $80,000 of income, $60,000 of income, two people in that household who don't have the childcare, food, shelter requirements of a larger family. We look at the standard deduction as part of what kind of sets aside part of your earnings as untaxable by the government to make sure you have this base level that you're building off of them, progressive taxation on top of that. The child tax credit and other specific family tax carve-outs are there to make sure that honestly, we just have a sane, reality-based family tax structure. We understand that there's not as much consumable income available for a family with young kids as there is for a family, with no kids or with kids who are out of college. And so we look at that as a way of, just treating families fairly based on what their disposable taxable income should be. Now, this year, there's going to be a reconciliation bill that has to work out how do we update our tax policy to be fair to families? The child tax credit has lost a fifth of its value to inflation since it was last expanded in 2017. And I think part of, again, just keeping a fair compact with families involves catching that payment up to inflation. So families are being treated on a level playing field with other families without children or with fewer children. I think one thing to emphasize is a baby bonus as a way of really meeting families in the gap where they're hoping for children, but keep feeling the pressure to delay, possibly to delay long enough that they don't have children at all, or to delay long enough that they have, again, that gap, fewer children than they want. You have your first child, but you start late enough, you don't have time for the second, or time for the third that you figure out what you want once you see how fun it is for your kids to have siblings. So a baby bonus is a payment that comes right after a baby is born. We're proposing a payment of $2,000, fully refundable. And it exists really as an income smoothing device. So when families have a baby, their income takes a big hit that first year. Their expenses go up. This is stuff we can quantify through social science, but it's not news to anyone who's been a parent. And so the goal of a baby bonus is to make that turbulence of the first year easier to navigate so that parents are able to take a risk in hope and welcome the children they want to have and welcome them earlier and more confidently than they would if they felt like they were doing it totally alone. Thank you.
Leah, fascinating. I don't know whether or not I agree with being less dynamic, but I certainly would appreciate having Social Security at some point. It's my pleasure now to introduce our final speaker, Jack Malday from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Emery, and thank you, Leah and Nick, for your great presentations. I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping it is viewable by everyone. Great. So I'm going to build off some of what Nick was talking about. Nick ran through population aging across the world, and he mentioned that this is a phenomenon we're seeing in the United States, and it is a real challenge from an economic perspective. So as we see the baby boomers retiring at the moment, we're seeing our dependency ratio get worse, and that leads to fiscal pressures. So we see a declining tax base as a share of declining tax base that we need to really support people in their retirement years. We also see declining labor force participation. So you can see in the chart on the right, over the past 20 years or so, we've seen steadily declining participation rates. And that is leading to workforce shortages across the economy. And as Nick outlined, we could start seeing declining population even in the United States due to population aging. And that risks our continued economic growth. So I mentioned healthcare. I mentioned workforce shortages. Healthcare is a key sector that we need to be focusing on going forward. So as we have an aging population, we have more and more people who will need healthcare services and care services, because we have a growing number of people in the later years of life, and they do need this support. And there's data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that looks at the total number of openings we can expect for different sectors over the next 10 years. And that data projects that healthcare and social assistance will have the greatest number of openings of any sector. And this is largely due to greater demand for healthcare services. And BPC released a report just a few months ago that looked into the occupations and sectors that are at particularly high risk of shortage. And we found that some of the highest risk occupations include registered nurses, nurse practitioners, medical health services managers, personal care and home health aides, and medical equipment repairers. So all of these are healthcare related, and that is driven by our aging population. We also found significant risk of shortage in other sectors, including construction, transportation, legal and financial management roles. And in the cause is quite consistent across these areas. We have retiring baby boomers and an aging population. So we do need to think about how can we get some more labor into these areas. Now, Nick touched on immigration as a key driver of labor force and population growth. I think Nick mentioned a few projections from the Census Bureau. There are other projections, including the Congressional Budget Office. They project that by 2033, without immigration, we would see population decline. So that's slightly different to the Census Bureau projection, but the key takeaway is the same, is that we are seeing, as our population ages, we're seeing birth rates decline, and we're becoming more and more dependent on immigration to see continued growth. Now, the question is, okay, how can we get more immigration into the United States? Is it a case that people are not interested in coming and we need to do more to attract them? Or is it the case that actually we're keeping them out? And I would say it's the latter. We have a very restrictive immigration system. So we have various visa limits that are set in law, annual visa limits that were set back in 1990. They have not been updated, even though we've had very significant shifts in our economic needs. And you can see on the left there a diagram with our annual green card limits. There's an overall limit of 675,000 each year. And much of that total limit actually goes towards family-based immigration. And we have a much smaller emphasis on employment-based immigration. And there are further limits within those limits. And on the right there, you can see we have some additional limits in the temporary visas. So H-1B, specialty occupation visa, and the H-2B, temporary non-agricultural visa. Furthermore, the H-1B visa, when we reach the limit, we actually give out these visas at random. So I think there's a lot of reform that we could do to our immigration system to not only increase the numbers of people, but also to let in those that will have the best economic impacts. And as additional evidence to the fact that we have no shortage of people who want to come to the United States, we have very, very large visa backlogs. On the left there is an estimate we made at the Bipartisan Policy Center about a year ago. And we estimated about 7.6 million people sitting in the green card backlog. And the cap-based backlog in blue is the backlog that exists simply due to those limits that I outlined. So these are people who have had their green cards approved, but they simply can't receive their green cards because of those annual limits. We also have just under 3 million people who are sitting in a processing backlog because their applications simply haven't been processed due to lack of resources. On the right there is a table from the Cato Institute, which shows the years to process different categories of green card. And you can see for the EB2 green card category, for India, it would take 134 years to process all of those green cards. And that's largely, again, due to the visa limits we have in place. So as a question, it is in our capability to increase immigration to the United States because we have no shortage of people who want to come here, but we have this political resistance to actually enacting change that would increase immigration. As we all know, it's a very controversial topic. There is both bipartisan support, but also bipartisan being against immigration as well. So the question is, how can we actually increase support for greater legal immigration? And there is some very interesting research done by the political scientist Alexander Kustov. His thesis is that we need to be focusing on demonstrably beneficial immigration policies. And in practice, this will mean high-skilled immigration, immigration that meets our workforce needs and addresses our workforce shortages. And if we implement these policies, these perhaps smaller wins that can build support for immigration, and it can show people how immigration really improves their lives. In the Biden administration, we saw a lot of immigration, largely due to humanitarian reasons. And of course, I am supportive of humanitarian immigration, but I think the point I'd make is that didn't help us increase the support for immigration across the country. In fact, it potentially had the opposite effect. So we do need to be looking at our legal immigration system and thinking about reforms that will help us attract more high-skilled immigration and fill our workforce needs. And I think in doing so, we can increase support for wider immigration reforms. I'll finish by saying that immigration is not the be-all and end-all. It will not solve all of our problems. I think that Leah outlined this well. Firstly, as we see global population decline, as Nick outlined, the prospects for immigration to the US will likely decline in the longer term. And that raises the question of, okay, if we have smaller prospects for immigration, but we also have a lot of labor force needs, how are we going to meet those needs? So I think we do need to be looking at family-based policy to increase fertility rates, as Leah outlined, reducing barriers to having a family. And I think we have to start talking more about automation and the potential for technology to enhance the productivity of workers in some of these key areas and to help fill the gap. So even in healthcare, there's a lot of potential for automation and AI and robotics to help, including in places like care homes. And the final thing I'd say is that immigration itself is not a panacea. The immigrants themselves they tend to be of working age and they contribute to our economy very well. Immigrants themselves will age and retire as well. So we have to be aware of that and the fact that at some point they become dependents. So we need to have a wide range of policy approaches to address our dependency ratio problem. And I think that, for example, raising the retirement age is going to have to be on the table for discussion as well. So I'll stop there, but very happy to answer any questions.
Jack, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Catherine Kish, who is the Vice Chair of the New Jersey Business Immigration Coalition, and she is also president of Einstein's Alley. Catherine will moderate the discussion today and bring the audience questions to the panel. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emery. I'm delighted to be here with our three distinguished panel members. And I'll be giving each of you an opportunity to respond to comments and questions from your fellow speakers. If we're lucky and there's time, we'll have some time for a larger discussion between all of you. But let's begin by asking Leah and Jack if they have any comments or questions on Nick's opening remarks. Either one of you.
Yeah, well, one question I had is how much uncertainty is there on the future path of global population? Are there scenarios where we do see continued growth? And if so, how likely are those? Or are we pretty confident that we're going to see global population decline?
Should I respond now, Catherine?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Jack, that's first of all, Leah and Jack, I immensely enjoyed your thought-provoking presentations. Thank you both for those. There's enormous uncertainty in future global demographic projections and a fair measure of uncertainty in U.S. projections as well, for these truth in advertising reasons. There is no reliable, authoritative scientific method for accurately forecasting birth rates. It's mainly a sort of a look at what's happened recently and guess what you think is plausible, plug it in and see what that looks like, sort of a game. And of course, as we know, immigration is fundamentally a wild card in projections, but it can have a tremendous impact on national trajectories. The trend in fertility all around the world for the last decade has surprised demographers. They've been playing catch up, kind of scratching their heads, trying to understand why birth levels have dropped as fast as they seem to have been doing, especially in lower income countries. Is it possible that there'll be a turnaround? Sure, it's possible, but then we have to ask ourselves what would make that happen? Uh, there's such a compelling correspondence between the number of children that women say they want and the number of children they have. It's not perfect by any means, as Leah's, you know, compellingly described to us, but it's the best indicator that we have to work with in this untidy world. And the desired fertility level, in these surveys just keeps on going down in so many parts of the world.
Okay. My goodness. Nick and Jack, do you have any questions or comments regarding Leah's presentation?
Um, Leah, I thought that was a superb outline of the um, challenges that face us with the family. I mean, you've made a strong case for child credits, and talk about that later, maybe. But can I ask you what you think could be done besides those sorts of credits to strengthen the family as an institution in the United States? Is this all in Uncle Sam's purview, or are there other ways that we can strengthen or try to strengthen?
I so appreciate the question because when you look at what's driving that fertility gap, a lot of it's driven by people not only not achieving having the children they want, but not achieving having the marriages they want or having them later in life than they hope for and planned for when children are harder to come by. And I think it is easier to kind of smooth the way for childbearing once people are married, or help them welcome a child, whether or not they're married when they're surprised by one. That's easier for the government to do than to directly support marriage. But one of the things I've seen as a program that I'm really enthusiastic about, but is a little outside of my policy work, is churches walking with couples that have been cohabiting or been in relationships and not taking that last step towards marriage. There's a Texas megachurch that ran specifically a marriage promotion program where they would pay for the wedding for these couples. The couples had to move out, they had to go to marriage counseling, and then they'd pay for the wedding. And I think what we're lacking a lot is not just the financial supports to make it easier to weather the income shocks of having a child, which is most of my focus, but that community support of saying, I love you and your boyfriend together. When are you getting married? How can I help? To really lower that sense of cost of marriage, to make it a natural thing people do when they're in love and they're open to having children. And I think we kind of have twinned problems, which is that there's a more diffuse sense of what marriage is for, which makes it harder for couples to know when are you ready to get married if you don't know exactly what you're promising or committing to in marriage. And there's just more of a hands-off sense of the culture of people get married when they want to and everything works out. And I think that's a little irresponsible. Again, when we look at the demographic data and say, well, when people follow this laissez-faire attitude, do they achieve the marriages and children they want? They don't. So where does the surrounding community have that role to play? And I've put the focus on the community because the government is best at distributing benefits, handing out money, taxing money. It takes a friend, a pastor, a parent to say, I want this for you. I love the person you're making your life with. How can I help you take that last step?
Thank you. Nick, Leah, any reactions or comments to Jack's presentation?
Jack, I appreciate you kind of going through the complexity of our immigration system, where there's many different routes in, different kinds of metering or expectations. But I feel like often in our discourse, we talk as though there's just a knob that says turn immigration up or turn immigration down. How can voters and politicians kind of get more into the weeds in a productive way, to make choices about what immigration mix we want, just not just the big top line number?
Good.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes, go ahead, please, Jack.
well, I think it's very helpful people to educate themselves on our immigration system. And I mean, there's very interesting research on when people are educated about how restrictive the system is. That is a big driver of increased increased enthusiasm for opening ourselves up to more immigration. And I think when people really educate themselves on the different visa categories we have, and what the role that those immigrants play in those visa categories, then we can have a really informed discussion about, okay, where do we want more immigration? Do we want more people coming in on permanent visas, on green cards, employment-based green cards? Do we want people coming in on temporary work visas? What should we have family-based immigration, we have employment-based immigration, we have a diversity lottery. And I think if we keep educating people, we can have that informed discussion, and we can think about exactly where we want to turn the dial. I do think it can be as simple as just increasing limits, and then we see more immigration through those pathways. And personally, I think we should be looking at our green card system, and the employment-based green card limit is much too low, especially when you can compare it to the family-based limit. We have a significant focus on family-based immigration, which I think is, we shouldn't be reducing family-based immigration, but we should certainly be correcting that imbalance and allowing more employment-based immigration into the country.
Good, interesting. Any other comments, questions from any of you to any of you? Nick?
Jack, I'd like to ask you, I'm guessing that you might be an immigrant to the United States, and this is not part of your presentation, but I think very much part of your wheelhouse. I mean, part of what I see as an advantage to the United States is whatever the secret sauce is in our formula that helps us assimilate newcomers as loyal and productive Americans. And I don't want to go Horatio Alger on it because we've got a lot of problems with that too. But do you think that the U.S. has a comparative advantage with respect to immigration as a receiving country in any sort of way? Or is that all just contingent upon policies and things that we can get right or get wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think the US has a long history of immigration, and we I think we have a long history of, and I should say I am a US citizen, but I moved to the US about 2 years ago from the UK. So you picked up on that well. But I think that yeah, we have a long history of welcoming immigrants and assimilating them well. And I think that unfortunately, at the moment, there's a little bit of a downswing in the political appetite for immigration. But I think that there's a sort of ebb and flow with that. And I think the key to ensuring continued assimilation is to recognize that we need to be looking at those pathways that are really going to meet our workforce needs and inject dynamism into our economy. And when people come here and they can contribute to our economy in a meaningful way, I think that really drives the assimilation, and it drives the positive reception towards immigration from our fellow citizens. And I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, we did see a massive bias towards humanitarian immigration in the Biden administration. And I'm not saying we don't have humanitarian immigration. I think it plays a very important role from an ethical perspective and an economic perspective. But I do think we need to be expanding immigration in some of these vital work-based categories. And I think that will help increase the enthusiasm for immigration and really lead to very effective assimilation.
And Nick, I'd love to speak to your question too, because I was born here, my parents were born here, but I grew up with 4 sets of Ellis Island certificates right by our door for my dad's parents and 2 of my great grandparents on my mom's side. And I think a big part of our family story has always been that America was, a uniquely good country to come to. My dad's side is Italian. They came very straightforwardly as economic migrants for a better life here, and with faith that this was a good place to raise children. And they went through that kind of gradual approach to assimilation where they lived in an Italian ghetto in a mostly Italian speaking community, where in an ordinary course of a day, you weren't speaking English to anyone else. You lived with people from the neighborhood, right? And then my dad grew up speaking both languages, lost his Italian gradually, and went to college when his parents never had. And when he went back to Italy to the family village, everyone hailed him as Il Professore. And on my mom's side, my family was Jewish. So we came out of Europe ahead of the Holocaust. Left France during L'Affaire Zola, when things were already very unpleasant for Jewish people. But in both cases, both for kind of religious persecution and ideological persecution reasons and for economic freedom, my family had a sense that they came to America because there was something good about America, and they wanted to be part not only of receiving it, but of building it and telling that story even down to generations, so that I know that's part of what I've been given and what I want to preserve.
Great story. Any other comments? Okay. Leah, I'm sorry, was somebody going to say something?
I was just going to ask, sorry, I was going to ask Leah,
Please.
you mentioned a few policy approaches, the child tax credit, baby bonus. Is there hard sort of empirical evidence out there that these things have the positive impact on fertility, and not necessarily just in the US, but have we seen these approaches work elsewhere in the world?
So they have marginal impacts. If you're paying people $2,000 when they have a baby, you shouldn't expect, a baby boom in response. It wouldn't turn things around completely.
Not enough.
$2,000 is a small amount. It can get people over a hump. But if you're seeing a big effect of it, I don't think you're seeing it because people had babies they wouldn't have otherwise have considered having. I think you see it because someone says, let's try for a baby this year. We've got a little more cushion than we expected. And when you have that first baby this year, you're freer to have the second or third baby down the line because you didn't wait as long. So that's where you see more of the effect.
Okay, good. Thank you. Considering all the current enforcement activities of the Trump administration, here Leah has just talked about her family coming over. Do you think we are losing the appeal that we have as the favored destination of immigrants? What do you think? Does it feel too hostile right now for immigrants?
I think the rhetoric at the moment from the Trump administration is quite hostile to people coming in illegally, but it's very positive towards the rhetoric, at least, is very positive towards work-based immigration. And I don't think the US is losing its appeal to people who want to come here through these established visa channels. We still have very large visa backlogs, and I think the country, we have seen encounters at the border drop quite significantly. I think the hostility to that sort of immigration, even if it's asylum seeking or refugee entry, we have seen I think a little bit less desire for people to enter through that method. But certainly as a destination to work and to enter through these established visa channels, I think the US remains a very popular destination.
Among the so-called desirable work-based immigrants, I'm concerned as I listen to you all, and I'm wondering, are there other countries that are moving up the scale in terms of attractiveness for immigrants? Are we losing some of our cachet?
I think it will
I'd put
vary.
you go ahead, Leah, then I'll follow you.
There's a lot that only America has, just as a large, dynamic, diverse nation.
good.
It's easier for many people around the world to find a kind of community to start within here, a place where you'll find neighbors or countrymen than it might be somewhere else. What I think is the real challenge is you've already seen tourism travel drop substantially to the US.
Especially from
And I think
Canadian tourists.
this
Yeah.
this struggle is that this administration has taken an approach of extremely punitive, extremely arbitrary in terms of who gets swept up, and extremely unappealable immigration enforcement. So you not only see folks who definitively entered illegally sent to lifetime prison without parole in a third party country, but you see folks who are entering on tourist visas, imprisoned for several days to a week, and then released without any clear irregularity being demonstrated. And I think part of what attracts people to America is the reliability of our rule of law. And if that gets eroded, you don't just lose your ability to compete for immigrants who want a stable place to build, you also lose out on tourists and others who want to visit for a week to see the sights and don't want to run the risk of being thrown in jail for that week instead.
Right. Nick, you had a comment?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all here in this gathering because we're all basically pragmatic supporters of immigration and its benefits to the United States. But let me try to play devil's advocate for just one moment about where we are and where we may be going, because this quite worries me. If you look at the CPS survey of the Census Bureau, which is what the monthly jobs reports come out of, that suggests that we now have somewhere north of 50 million foreign-born Americans in our country. That would be a higher proportion than we have ever before recorded, even during the first wave of immigration. Remember what happened during the first wave of immigration. There was a very strong and radical reaction against immigration in that first Gilded Age. And it wasn't because people were, suddenly possessed by a spasm of crazy, although that does happen from time to time. The uh, the trends that were occurring in this first Gilded Age were that income and wealth gaps were growing. There was a dampening of wage progress for less skilled native-born Americans, and gradually a sort of an anti-immigration movement, starting in the States, tried to get to Washington, probably would have gotten to Washington if World War I hadn't come along.
Yeah.
Right? And then all of a sudden we have this, forcing crisis, which stopped all immigration. But in the 20s, politics got right back to it, and there were important constituencies that wanted to radically restrict immigration, and it was radically restricted until the mid 60s. It took it took almost half a century for this to return. So if you want to think about what could happen to poison American public support for immigration, it's happened before. And I'm not sure we could have done anything much more brilliantly than the southern border crisis that we had to poison popular support for general immigration. And I hope that that doesn't get wrecked.
Yeah. It's the example you put up of the Gilded Age is kind of frighteningly familiar, isn't it?
It sounds like an echo.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does. Um, if the global immigration numbers decline, but political repression around the world continues, is it possible that future migration will largely consist of people fleeing political or climate crises, in which case countries like the United States, who is more comfortable with people seeking to fill workplace shortages, will the Americans be willing to accept a larger percentage of refugees? What's your sense of that?
Well, I guess it's very speculative, but I think if we do, and I think it's very likely that we continue to see worsening workforce shortages without reform. And I think that will be felt by people across the country. And when it's felt by people across the country in a very acute way, I think people will realize that we do need immigration. We do need to let more people into the country. I think if in and a point I should make that I don't think I mentioned earlier is that refugees, asylum seekers, they contribute to our economy in very meaningful ways as well, even though they're slightly less formal channels. And I think that yes, I think if we do have a worsening economic labor market outlook and people are feeling the effects of labor shortages, I think the public openness to even refugee-based and asylum seeker entry into the country should probably increase. But I think in the meantime, we do need to be looking at these formal channels. There certainly right now, there's no shortage of people who want to enter into these high skilled work-based channels. And if we have those reforms now, that can really improve the support for all types of immigration.
Good. But do you think that?
May I weigh in there? I
Yeah.
think if you look at the historical scope of Americans' policies towards refugees and the international treaties and commitments we've made, our focus has always been on refugees who are distinctly and personally at risk in their country, people who belong to a persecuted class, people who practice a forbidden religion, people who oppose a repressive government. I find it less likely that we'll shift to having the kind of broad-based climate refugee program where everyone living in a certain country might be eligible to come to America. That'd be a big shift in how we've historically seen refugees.
One other thing to bear in mind, we've got surprisingly one of the differences between the first Gilded Age and our current Gilded Age is we didn't have a social welfare state in the 1890s, and we've got one that friends in Europe and probably in the UK think is pretty stingy, but it's big and it's largely unfunded, largely funded off of public debt. Which means it's funded by our children and the unborn. But today's refugees are also going to be involved in our public benefit system. And we have very surprisingly little work on the budgetary and fiscal impact of migration, humanitarian migration, illegal migration. That's an oversight that we're going to have to correct when we're running a $2 trillion budget deficit. It's doable, but for some reason it's not doneable.
Okay, good point. Some questions from the audience. Are we balancing the concept of improving birth rates and immigration policy? Are they considered contradictory, or can they be seen as complementary goals? Because we've been talking about both today.
I think they're substantially complementary, including because they're working the problem from different ends. No one who's hoping to have a child but struggling with economic security feels comforted by saying your Social Security will be taken care of because we're bringing in more people to fill out the workforce. Parents don't have a child for the sake of Social Security. They have a child because they want someone to love. And I think we can think of these as two related interlocking problems that admit of complementary solutions.
So you're not thinking that giving a medal to mothers in the United States is going to be a positive policy, huh?
Well, what's funny? I've heard that batted around, and I think what it misses is that it's harder to find someone in the United States who is so unpolarized that everyone would feel like it was a genuine honor to receive a medal from them. The country that has tried a version of this that genuinely produced a baby boom is Georgia, the country,
That's right.
not the state,
Yes, yes.
where substantial amounts of the population are Orthodox. And they said the Orthodox patriarch would personally baptize your child if they were your third or later child. And that genuinely produced a baby boom in those later kids. But that's because he was universally beloved and respected. And if we got to the point in America where you had a figure who, if they came to your child's baptism, if they gave a medal to the mom, that was unambiguously regarded as a good thing, I think we'd actually just be in a substantially healthier polity than we are right now.
That's interesting. I'm just wondering, do we see any positive direction in attitudes, or are we stuck with this whole idea of we're fearful of various cultural issues? We are fearful of people who don't look the same as the original settlers, but who knows what they looked like. I mean, are we possibly going to be able to become a more welcoming country, even though it's kind of looking like that Gilded Age example you gave, Nick? Is there hope for us?
I think there's tremendous hope. I mean, what my impression is that the American public is still, hope it continues, still very pro-legal immigration and very anti-illegal immigration. And there are a lot of reasons that Americans are anti-illegal immigration that don't have to do with how much melanin people have. I mean, starting with rule of law and national sovereignty, you know. So I tend to think like Leah that there's a great complementarity between strengthening the family and welcoming, you know, newcomers, productive, loyal newcomers to the United States. I mean, one of the curious and somewhat troubling things to follower of demographic trends is how the U.S. fertility level has tanked since the Great Recession. I mean, the economic fundamentals are not that radically different in the US from Canada, from Europe, from other rich countries. They're somewhat different, but not that different. What's really changed over the past 15 years are American public attitudes. Uh, Back when the United States had more or less replacement level birth rates as a great exception to other rich countries in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. There was a big attitudinal difference between the US and the continent. Much more optimism in the US, much more religiosity in the US, much more patriotism in the US, among other bundle of things you could look at. Those value differences don't look as great today, as pronounced today as they were then, and the fertility difference isn't as pronounced either. You know, mentality, outlook, expectations, all of those things matter so much in thinking about your future and the future of your family.
Right. You know, one of the things we keep bumping up against in our discussion and in I think your slides, Nick, is that our numbers of availability of visas, et cetera, are fixed and tight and haven't been changed in a very long time. Given the politics today, do you, any of you, see the opportunity for politicians to positively step forward and create some smart reforms in numbers or whatever?
I absolutely see.
Yeah.
Yeah, BPC has done polling on attitudes towards immigration, and we find bipartisan support is most clear when we think about employment-based immigration and having our immigration system fill gaps in the workforce. And we've seen various bipartisan bills introduced in recent years that have that focus with regard to our healthcare workforce. There's bipartisan support for our agricultural workforce, and a significant portion of our agricultural workforce is undocumented, but there is bipartisan support for a path to citizenship, path to legal status for many of those workers. So I think as long as we emphasize the economic benefits and think about how immigration can fill gaps in the workforce and strengthen our labor force and increase dynamism, I do see that there is hope for legislative change on some of these issues.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions we've continually gotten from several audience members is people are interested in knowing whether this webinar is going to be online, and yes, it will be. There are also some questions about would you be willing to make your slides available
Sure.
to the people who participated? So that's
Happy
great. Great, we will do that. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. This is great. And now I'm afraid the clock is moving. So I'm going to introduce another board member, and that's Ryan Lilienthal. And we know that we could spend so much more time discussing this, but Ryan's got the official hook to end the presentation. So Ryan Lilienthal is a board member, longtime person interested in immigration. He's an immigration lawyer and also an accomplished artist. So over to Ryan.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the New Jersey Immigration Coalition. I also serve on the committee that helped plan today's event. On behalf of the entire board and all of our member organizations, I would like to thank today's speakers for helping us better understand such an important and challenging topic. I'd also like to thank Catherine Kish and Emery Edwards for helping to moderate today's program, and also the staff members of our partner organization, the New Jersey Business and Industry Association, for all their behind-the-scenes work. And of course, Nicholas Mondalto, who has been indispensable to our coalition and shepherding programs like this. We should definitely not forget some of the important questions we have asked ourselves today. Will migration continue to serve as a distinguishing feature of our society? What have we gained from migration that we could conceivably lose in the future? What can be done to maintain our appeal as a destination for immigrants? Can the threat of massive global and domestic depopulation be averted or lessened? Hopefully, we have arrived at some preliminary answers to all these questions, and we continue to search for new evidence to further enlighten ourselves on these issues. Before we end today's program, I'd like to put in a brief word for our coalition. We are extremely proud of what we have accomplished in the few short years of our existence. New Jersey is only one of a few states that have a business-oriented immigration coalition, because we're committed to bipartisanship and evidence-based policy development. We've attracted many organizations with similar commitments. We've also recently acquired nonprofit status and are in the process of transitioning from an all-volunteer organization to one with core staffing. Our strength comes from the large number of organizations that are aligned with our mission. For that reason, we welcome new companies and associations to join our coalition. If you are sympathetic to our work and represent a company or organization that might like to join our coalition, please communicate with us using the email on the screen. There's no fee to join the coalition. You just have to support the mission and principles of the coalition that are found on our website. We pride ourselves on being a nonpartisan organization committed to education work in the immigration field. Thank you for joining us today. And once again, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel members for sharing their research findings and insights on such an important issue. Thank you.